How Venezuela fell into a crisis, and what could happen next. Supermarket shelves in Venezuela are chronically bare, and power shortages are so severe that government offices are now open only 2 days a week. The healthcare system has collapsed, the crime rate is one of the world's worst, and inflation is rapidly eroding what remains of the currency's value. Here are some basic questions and answers on how Venezuela got to this point under President Nicolas Maduro and what could happen next. How could this happen in a country that has the largest reserves of oil in the world? The price of oil, Venezuela's only significant export, has plummeted, which means revenue could fall by 40% this year. The government's huge borrowing, partly a legacy of the years when oil prices were far higher, has helped bring the crisis to a head because Venezuela now has far less money to repay its foreign debt, forcing Mr. Maduro to slash imports in order to avoid default. On top of that are the consequences of a drought, which has shriveled the country's hydropower generation, the critical source of electricity. Is the situation going to get worse or better in the coming months? The country owes roughly $120 billion to foreign creditors and must make a payment of nearly $7 billion this year, most of it in the final quarter. Speculation has persisted that Venezuela may default on the payment or have to default next year, especially if oil prices remain low. Venezuela's problems have been worsening for years, since well before Mr. Maduro took power. What is different now? The political opposition in Venezuela is far more unified than it was during the era of Mr. Maduro's popular predecessor, Hugo Chavez. He died in 2013, but many economists say his policies of state ownership, unfettered spending, subsidies and domestic price controls are at least partly responsible for the crisis today. With Mr. Chavez gone, Mr. Maduro's opponents have won a majority of seats in the national legislature and have collected nearly 2 million signatures on a petition to start a recall of Mr. Maduro. So why doesn't Venezuela just default on its foreign debt and force Wall Street creditors to renegotiate more favorable terms? Venezuela may have a lot to lose in a default, too. Its foreign debt is partly owed by the state-owned oil company, PDVSA, the country's principal generator of revenue. Venezuelan officials fear that a default would bring bondholder lawsuits. That could severely disrupt PDVSA's operations and result in seizures of the company's overseas assets, perhaps even from its Houston subsidiary, Citgo Petroleum Corporation, which owns 3 big refineries and has thousands of gas stations. Citgo is vital for Venezuela because it generates much of the oil revenue that the country is still receiving. Despite the political tensions between the two nations, the United States is Venezuela's largest customer. Venezuelan officials are also mindful of Argentina's default in 2001, which took more than a decade of litigation to resolve. If you default on PDVSA, you have Argentina too, and nobody wants that, said Pablo Venturino, managing director of Whitebridge Capital Management, the New York investment firm that specializes in Latin American debt securities. PDVSA, he said, is the main generator of cash flow for your country. Why is Venezuela's inflation rate so high? The cost of foreign goods has soared in Venezuela, which is importing far less as part of Mr. Maduro's effort to conserve dwindling central bank reserves. The government has sought to soften the impact by raising wages and printing more bolivars, the national currency. But that is a recipe for inflation, creating too much money chasing too few goods. By some estimates, the inflation rate could reach nearly 500% this year and 1,600% in 2017. Venezuelan economic crisis. Families living in Venezuela can wait 18 hours a day at the supermarket to obtain the right to buy petrol, rice or pasta in small quantities, according to foreign policy. Problems with hunger and malnutrition are worsening, and large Venezuelan companies like Empresas Polar, the country's largest beer maker, are closing their doors. In a statement made by American credit institution Moody's, it was not possible to find enough currency to carry out debt payments this year. The political conditions leading to economic collapse in Venezuela continued for a decade, but the situation has deteriorated considerably in recent years due to the decline in oil prices, environmental factors and the failure of President Nicolas Maduro's government to tackle the country's troubles. He believed that Venezuela would need significant foreign intervention from the International Monetary Fund or other institutions to get out of the current economic situation. Decline in crude oil prices, drought and blackness. Venezuela, sometimes referred to as a petrostate or a nation that derives its wealth in large numbers, is one of the founding members of OPEC and one of the world's largest oil exporters. Since oil was discovered in the early 20th century, and especially after the industry was nationalized in 1976, it became a critical component of the country's economy. According to OPEC today, oil accounts for 95% of the country's export earnings and the oil and gas industry accounts for 25% of GDP. In recent years, oil prices have fallen rapidly around the world, and Venezuela's dependence on exports has worsened pre-existing economic conditions, such as the current debt and currency devaluation, before Maduro's 2013 outlook, according to the International Crisis Group, non-profit, non-governmental organization that conducts field surveys on violent conflicts. An oil-rich country like Venezuela would not have to be economically collapsed of this magnitude. From 2006 to 2012, Venezuela increased its external borrowing by 5 times, but this movement was unsustainable. Venezuela is still importing most of its products, and it is creating major challenges for the country's economy, along with the depreciation of its primary exports and the cost of swelling. Self-sufficiency in food production has also been limited to environmental factors. According to NPR, drought has required electricity interruptions to save Venezuela's farming water resources and energy. Electricity disruptions in the address of Electricity Secretary Luis Mata Dominguez this year, calling for necessary sacrifice for about 4 hours a day, also prevented the ability to produce within the country. Rising temperatures also play a part in the worsening conditions of Venezuela's environmental landscape. As Reuters reported last year, the climate bird population of the country is seen by scholars as part of the overall health of the ecosystem, in the case of extinction. Despite these environmental factors, Chávez's successor says that Maduro is reluctant and unable to bring back the balance to the Venezuelan economy, which creates an increasing political opposition movement. Leadership crisis. Chávez, who came to power in 2002 and served as president until his death in 2013, has created addiction that annoys the public today. The conditions that lead to Chávez's rise are described as the perception of corruption among Venezuela's elite and widening inequality. Maduro's governance is often thought of as an extension of Chávez. It is noted that public confidence in Maduro, who serves as Chávez's vice president, has quickly fallen as the country deepens its economic crisis. According to a report organized by the BBC today, a referendum to remove it from power was taken to trigger the next phase in remembrance that 37% of the 1959 signatures were made on the first day of the public opening. His recall ban, will last until 2019. A reminder montage timing is important. The recall law to take place in January 2017 after the midpoint of the mandate will replace Maduro, according to the legislation, replacing the vice president. Maduro is trying to prevent this, since the political opposition wants the remembrance to start earlier. According to the International Crisis Group, the poor of Venezuela hit the collapse of the country after Chávez's moderate gain during the socialist regime. Maduro, the socialist at the same time, sometimes confused Venezuela with practical proposals to resolve the crisis. For example, he recommended residents this year to raise urban farms to produce their own food. However, according to a report published by NPR, the ability to produce food at home has become impossible due to the seed pest, as well as the drug needed to overcome livestock. The U.S. has criticized Maduro and has had a tense relationship with the Venezuelan government for many years. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. Maduro and opposition leaders hope to go beyond the old rhetoric that divides the two countries on an ideological line in talks aimed at closing the gap between opposition leaders who advocate it. Due to the logistical reasons of the economic crisis, it is difficult to return. Among the many famines that the country faces, there are expeditions to the country and